Welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Kylie Hanish, and I'm very excited to bring this episode to you. She is going to be talking about her experience of being diagnosed later in life after kids with autism and ADHD. And this is a conversation that has needed to happen on this podcast for a while, but also needs to happen in general. And I'm also looking forward to having a couple more guests on here in the near future who are going to talk about their experience as well. But Kylie reached out to me knowing that this was a very important topic to address, and I'm so grateful that she did. I think you'll learn a lot from this episode and our conversation. Kylie is going to talk about how that diagnosis impacted her and what non-stereotypical autism looks like, and how getting a diagnosis can be a privilege, why self-diagnosis is valid. And we're going to go over some information about autism in women and in motherhood, and also the role of hormones that play out in autism and ADHD. Dr. Kylie Hanish is a neurodivergent occupational therapist specializing in mental health during the perinatal period, which includes pregnancy, postpartum, and perinatal loss. She is the founder of Return to Zero Hope, a nonprofit organization that provides inclusive and compassionate education and support for bereaved families after pregnancy and infant loss. In addition, they also provide training and support to health providers in order to foster more confidence when working with these families. As I said, she was recently diagnosed as autistic ADHD, which has led her down the path of learning more about autism in adults, autism and grief, and autistic mothers. She has been mentoring her occupational therapy research group as they further their exploring the sensory experiences of autistic mothers and how that relates to engagement in everyday life. I'm very excited for you to hear this conversation. So let's talk with Kylie. Welcome, Kylie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on the show again.
Yeah, I'm really grateful and happy to be talking to you about this topic. It's come up a lot for me recently. People reaching out about stuff related to autism diagnosis later in life and impacting motherhood. So I'm really happy to start this conversation with you because we haven't done this on the podcast yet, and it's super important. So thanks for sharing with us today. If you wouldn't mind, just start with your story wherever you'd like to, and we'll kind of set up the frame for all the other great stuff you're going to talk about.
Yeah. So my story related to my autism and ADHD diagnosis started about maybe like the fall of 2022. So maybe a year and a few months ago. And my son had received an ADHD diagnosis along with some learning disabilities about a year prior. But again, at that point, I didn't really know much about it. I'm an OT. I should know. I don't. And I was like, what the heck? He doesn't, that doesn't really fit him. But it made sense once I started learning about it. And so then, but I didn't think of any of it for me. So then my sister got a diagnosis maybe a year later, and she started sending me things about ADHD in women and just how it looks different. There's different types. And so I started reading that. And one thing that really stuck out to me was the inability to filter out auditory stimuli. And I have always had a lot of auditory sensitivities, in addition to other sensory sensitivities. And so that resonated with me. And so I decided, and don't do this because I shouldn't have done this, but I started taking my son's medication, like the starter dose that we had from him before. And it changed my life. Like it made me feel like I put on a helmet over my head and I could go out into the world and not be like inundated with all this stimuli. And I was like, oh my goodness. And then my psychiatrist she's like, well, you need an official assessment. I mean, I'll give this because I'm like, no, you have to prescribe it. Like, and she's, and so then I was so busy, I just couldn't do it. And so the next time I met with her, I was like, I went to Target at 6 o'clock at night and it didn't faze me. Because one of my coping strategies is I go to stores when they open because I can't deal with the people, like the energy from the people, the noise, all of that.
Hmm.
And so the
Hmm.
fact that I could go to Target at 6 o'clock at night was like unheard of. So
Right.
she
That's
was
go
like,
time at Target, like every,
she's she's
yeah.
like, oh, interesting.
Hmm.
So I then, about a month after I started taking the stimulant medication, I heard a podcast by Astra, and she had spoken at the Stanford Neurodiversity Conference about like the fall of 2022, I think, talking about people who are highly sensitive. Could they be level 1 autism? And so I've, for the past like 5 to 7 years, maybe really identified with the highly sensitive person label to
Hmm.
help explain me and who I am. And I listened to this podcast um, and I was like, oh my goodness, this explains everything about me. Like all these quirky things that I just thought I was different and weird or whatever. But like when you put language to certain things,
Mm, yeah.
it it was like a light bulb went off. So I went, I'm an OT professor, one of my hats that I wear, and one of my students in my class was very openly autistic and ADHD, and she said to me, she's like, Dr. Hannish, if you put the Asperger qualities next to the HSP qualities, they're really the same. Um, and and so I just went on this deep dive of like autism in women. And it was like life changing for me. I
Mm,
really like, at that point, I was like, this resonates, this explains me. It was like this missing puzzle piece to
that's cool.
like the lens of seeing my whole life and like why I am the way I am.
Right.
I did pursue a formal diagnosis. I mean, I needed it. I get the psychiatrist wanted it for the ADHD, and
Hmm.
and I went through the process, and I already self-diagnosed myself
Right.
correctly with
Right.
autism and ADHD, and nothing really came out of the diagnosis
Mm.
process. It was
Mm.
like I wanted the validation because, like, but
Right.
that didn't what it didn't do anything. But and I've just been on this deep dive, and then I like came across another article or an article by a woman named Dr. Talser in the UK, who did a qualitative study about the sensory experiences of autistic mothers.
Hmm.
And she interviewed 7 mothers and explained like all the challenges that come while you're autistic being a parent
Hmm.
and some of the strategies that they use. And that also for me was like another huge shift because
Yeah.
it parenting, and I talk about this pretty openly, parenting has been really, 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 I don't even want to say hard. It's been debilitating for me. Like,
Mm.
I feel like the moment I became a parent, it broke me.
Yeah.
And that also followed my stillbirth. So my first
Hmm.
child was
Oh, sure.
stillborn.
Yeah.
And then I had another child. So it's just like all this. And so the what was probably happening after my daughter was born, after my son, who was stillborn, it was like I probably had postpartum PTSD.
You're right.
And I also had sensory overload,
Hmm.
like the idea of like, and we can get into this later,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so it's just like, so that's kind of been where I am. And I'm just like diving in and figuring out, like, okay, it was like grieving over the fact how many different providers I've been to,
Right.
and nobody, no, like nobody screens for this. Um,
Correct.
yeah,
Right.
and it's like, and the amount of suffering and the amount of feeling so weird or different, and then also the this like ableist society that we live in, that we should be able to
Right.
do certain things. And then it's like, why can I not function that way? Like
Right.
something's like, I live in a state, I feel like, I mean, a constant state of overwhelm, but it's
Yeah.
also like my battery, like if I was like a cell phone, my battery's
Right.
like always on low power mode,
Yeah. Yeah.
chronic fatigue, like
Uh-huh.
all this stuff. And so I just like, that's kind of, I don't know, there's so much more, but that's kind of
Of
the
course.
story of like how I learned.
It sounds like, um, I mean, so relieving, which it doesn't, that word doesn't feel like enough to describe what you're saying. Life changing for sure. I mean, if to be able to go from, and this is, I think, true for a lot of things, to be able to go from, I don't know what's wrong, um, but I know something's wrong, to like, okay, I figured it out, and it's a thing, and there's like, I have options, because it just ends up feeling so, when you don't know, if I think feels lonely, and you don't know how to explain yourself to others. Um, and I mean, it impacts relationship, all of that stuff. So just being able to say, this is what it is, and when you have a feeling come up, you can say, oh, it's because of this, not because I'm like some deeply flawed human.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
That's
it gave me permission to start, like, once I understood, like, I needed certain things
hmm
for my nervous system,
hmm
permission to do the thing, to start changing my life a little bit or saying no to things because I know why I have to say no. You know,
yeah,
it's like a,
yeah.
like, in like energy management and like the prevention and
hmm
so stuff like that. There, I would say there's a grief, but also freedom, you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
but both.
Wow. Yeah, that's hugely impactful. And based on I think part of the challenge, what I've heard with ADHD anyways, and probably it's the same with autism, is that if it's not showing up very like, super clearly in childhood, and kind of tagged or noticed or diagnosed or supported at that point, people can go on for years and years and years, not having an understanding of why they function the way they do or feel the way that they do. So like getting a diagnosis later in life, um, I imagine providers aren't really looking for it, because it's this like quote unquote diagnosis of in childhood.
Yeah.
Is that what
Well,
you've
I
seen?
think, yeah, I mean, so women women and people who are not white boys. So anyone who's not a white boy is less likely to be diagnosed.
Ugh,
And so the right now they're saying the current male to female ratio of autism is 4-1, but actually it's more 3-4. So there's
that's
more
quite different.
women,
Yeah.
and that 80% of girls are undiagnosed by the age of 18.
Wow.
So most people do not know. And so number
That's
one, less likely to be diagnosed if there's not a co-occurring intellectual disability.
oh,
Okay,
okay.
there's
Okay.
diagnosis is often based on behavior markers,
hmm
so which are created from pre-existing conceptions of what autism looks like,
Right. Quote
right?
unquote.
And
Right. Right.
so we base it on the external behaviors. But the thing is that women and other people, right, we mask, so we hide what's going
hmm
on. And we also have more internal symptoms
mm
that we can't see.
hmm
And so we have that, we kind of like hold it in.
Right.
Um, we have less of the social emotional communication difficulties than males.
hmm
However, women still have a hard time like making and sustaining relationships.
hmm
But again, this is like a lot of internal stuff.
Right.
And then so it's like if if you're a person who's not severely impacted in an external behavior way,
hmm
then you're not going to be diagnosed.
Wow.
But then the other thing is like we see, right, there's a lot of co-occurring health conditions with neurodivergence. There's more PTSD, depression, and anxiety, suicide. Women are seen as hypochondriacs. Okay, so like me, I've had chronic fatigue for how many years?
Right.
And the gaslighting, and I'm like, I know, like when my son was born, who's 11 now, I'm like, I'm just so exhausted. Like, oh,
Yeah.
you don't seem depressed. That's what
Oh,
they told me. Or
okay.
like, oh, being a mom is just really tiring. But I've gotten
That's
to the point where I'm like,
ugh.
cannot get out of bed, you know?
Right, right.
So I don't know. You were
Um,
saying something, sorry.
no, I appreciate that. I'm really interested in the co-occurring. I assume there's quite a list of the potential co-occurring conditions. But the you were speaking to the gaslighting, and I mean, um, for any woman who has is trying to figure out any diagnosis, this happens. The kind of gaslighting, specifically during motherhood. Oh, of course you're tired. You're a mom, or of course you're tired. You have 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, whatever it is, and it's just. I mean, you see this in perinatal mental health across the board. Um, but and really anything for women, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. So like you and other people who are talking about this is so important, because it if providers either don't have the training to see it, or are assuming that symptoms are associated with something else, then it kind of is on you to figure a lot of stuff out. um
Yeah.
and yeah, what and then have to try and talk to providers about what you think is going on, and go through the whole
Yeah.
process of convincing someone or whatever it is. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
exhausting.
There's a group in Vermont called All Brains Belong, and they have this project going called All the Things. And it's
Mm,
basically how, like, there all these co-occurring health conditions are actually part of the neurodivergence. And
mm.
they have like a letter for if you're a patient to bring to your doctor.
Oh, cool.
And then they also have a clinician guide broken up into the different systems of, like, I can't remember, but like gut,
Yeah.
hypermobility, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a huge co-occurring. POTS is another huge
Mm.
co-occurring health syndrome. Chronic fatigue, gut stuff, sleep, like all these different things. And so that is helpful. And at the same time, I've I personally have like shared that with a provider, and they're like, "Oh, I saw you sent that. I haven't looked through it." But so they're not, and I understand people are busy, but
Sure.
you do have you have to do so much education and on your own to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll include that website. You said
Yeah.
allthethings.com or .org. I'll
I
find
can,
it and
yeah,
put it in our
I'll
show
send it
notes.
to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, especially for people who are
Yeah.
just hearing this and wondering for
Yeah.
themselves, that sounds like a good place
Yeah.
to go.
And
Um,
then my other favorite and resource, and I can share this with you too, is
yeah.
Neurodivergent Insights. Um, so they have a podcast called Divergent Conversations. I was on a
Nice.
podcast of theirs talking about autism and grief. And
Oh,
then she herself is a psychologist, autistic ADHDer, and she is passionate about training other therapists, but she just does a lot of education.
mhm.
A lot of great information. I mean, for everybody too.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
guides, worksheets, stuff like that. So
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'll include that as
yeah,
well. And you were mentioning a bunch of co-occurring conditions, and before we started talking today, you had also talked about the role of hormones. And I'd love to know what you have looked into and found out.
yeah. So one of my recent deep dives is like the impact of hormone fluctuations on autism and ADHD. And so there's most of the research out there is with ADHD. So the
Mm,
idea that estrogen is a powerful hormone that controls your neurotransmitters of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, which are big players in ADHD and depression. So when estrogen drops drastically, which is like before you're like in the second half of your cycle, after you give birth, there's like a huge drop in hormones. And
Mm-hmm.
then in perimenopause, your estrogen is dropping. And so what they're seeing is exacerbated symptoms of ADHD during these times. So there's an increased risk for PMDD, which is like really bad PMS for people who don't know that. Perimenopause, and then higher risk of postpartum depression, anxiety, OCD. And so what's happening is like the people may have these experiences like, oh, like I have PMDD, and but there's not the link to the ADHD piece. And so
Mm-hmm.
is like, even if you're taking a stimulant and your estrogen is dropping a lot, that the stimulant's not enough to control those symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, I know for myself what is working in terms of a treatment. So like I'm in perimenopause. So like I am on hormone replacement therapy. As I told you before, I increased my SSRI and I'm on a stimulant, and that has helped a lot with my sensory sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I know that when I like decreased my estrogen, my depression got worse. And so I'm like, at least my psychiatrist knew, it's like, okay, we need to increase the SSRI. But it's a lot of playing around. But I think most people don't, like, even if they're a reproductive psychiatrist, they're not necessarily trained in the neurodivergence piece. And so
Right. Right.
that's like, and it's new though.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, you didn't learn it at all. It's just all really new.
Right. Oh, um, so yeah, I mean, it would be really challenging then to find this like unicorn of a provider who can like see all and not a lot of people are open to learning and figuring it out, and a lot of doctors have to do that, like creative problem solving stuff, which is great. But even more important than to kind of take note of your own symptoms or your own um, experience
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to
So
check
like,
in.
well, it's like, I think if it's like you have this awareness and then tracking,
Mm,
like tracking like what symptoms are getting worse at what times of the month, and when does it feel better?
mm,
And um and there has to be like some on your end educating yourself, and then going in and saying like, I'm noticing this, what can we do about it?
mhm.
um And I can share with you, like one page on my website, I have links to some webinars and articles about this hormonal piece too.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so there's not much research, it sounds like.
There's not, no.
Oh,
And
okay.
what I've learned is mostly through, have you heard of Attitude Magazine
Hmm.
online? So
Yeah.
like they're they're putting out some information, like if they have a few researchers who have done webinars on this topic, and
Hmm.
but there's not a lot out there.
Right. So if for, I mean, how did you find out? You mentioned like level one autism and different types of ADHD. How did you figure out those things?
Um,
Like, is there I'm sure it's a lot of places you went to, but that's a lot to
um,
kind of research.
um, I think I don't. Well, the level one autism, that has to do with like what levels of support you need in
Mm,
terms of like, I don't need a lot of extra supports in terms of uh, and that was with, so like those two things came with my diagnosis when
oh,
I did
okay.
my assessment.
I
Like
see.
I think I had like inattentive ADHD, but you can read about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I would assume Neurodivergent Insights probably has some of that, and she has like recommendations for screeners that you can do
Oh,
on
cool.
yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something, I mean,
Yeah.
and I think there's also like, there's with ADHD, there's like an attentive type hyperactivity, and then there's a combination. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just,
There's a
but
lot to figure out. In terms of getting a diagnosis, I know that uh, having a full psych eval or having any type of evaluation that's in depth takes time and takes resources, and it's not something that everybody has access to. So, like these kind of self-evaluation tools are even more important for that.
yeah,
Yeah, can you speak to any of that that you've
yeah.
seen that you've come across? Yeah.
I mean, I believe, and I think other people believe this too, it's not just my personal opinion, is that a self-diagnosis is sometimes more accurate than even a formal diagnosis, because a lot of people doing the assessments do not know what autism looks like in women or people who are not white boys, like if it's not
Mhm,
presenting in the external stereotypical ways.
mhm,
So it's, in addition to the things you just said, it's also, there's not people who are trained in non-stereotypical presentation of autism.
mm,
So that's another barrier.
mm,
So I believe that self-diagnosis is really valid. Um, if you have a child who is neurodivergent with like ADHD or autism, 80% genetic um, chance, like there's 80% chance that you will have it too, because it's genetic.
mhm,
And so what I think what we see a lot with parents is like their kid will receive a diagnosis,
mhm.
and then they'll start recognizing, oh, these are traits that I have too.
Sure. Yeah.
And but I think there's also the other thing we need to talk about is stigma. There's such a
Mhm.
stigma, right?
Yes.
It's like,
Yeah.
even when I tell people like I'm autistic, because I think it's so exciting because it explains everything.
Right.
They're like, oh, well, you make eye contact, or you're really successful or smart or whatever, like things like that. And like
Right.
they think that autism is nonverbal and they
Mm.
can't make eye contact. Those
Mhm,
are like
mhm,
what
mhm.
people think.
Right.
And that is true for some people. But there's so many of us that that's not the case.
Right.
And so also like I don't share, I overshared with people like I disclosed my diagnosis, and now if I don't want their opinion, like I just know that they're gonna probably be like, what?
Mhm.
Um, so I think like, so if you're curious, it's like starting there, you can do those screeners, just start reading and see if like the certain aspects resonate with you. And then
Mhm.
also understanding that like you don't have to, there's like different I don't know what I call categories
Mhm.
within the autism traits. I would different categories within autism traits. And so you don't have to have like sensitivities or issues in all of those. Like
Right.
it doesn't mean all or nothing. It's
Right.
like these areas, yes, these areas, no. And I think it's just learning about yourself.
Right. Everybody looks different. They have
Yeah.
mhm,
And
mhm.
like finding language for me is really important to explain what I'm experiencing or the way I approach things like that.
Yeah. So going back to the autism diagnosis and motherhood, you were speaking a little bit about what you noticed, I guess, after the fact that you were
Yeah.
able to link these were the challenges that you had connected to that. What else are you seeing, either for yourself or other people that you talk with?
Yeah, I mean, so we know that autistic people in general have sensory sensitivities. And we know that parenthood is a time where sensory demands are increased, anyways.
Right, for sure.
And so, if we already are very sensitive and we have more of that, like we're seeing like the a lot of challenges come up, right? So, like in terms of how does this impact our daily lives? Well, it impacts our sleep. It impacts our ability. And so I guess with sleep, so, and this is also with people with postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, but like, right, it's like you can't fall asleep. You can't go to sleep once your baby has fallen back asleep. Like that
Mhm.
was me. I was just awake for hours.
Mhm.
Um, Self-care piece. So with this one, it's before we had children, we have we often have strategies to help regulate our nervous system. We
Right.
don't know that that's what we're doing,
Right. Right.
but when the child is born, you have no time, right? And so you lose access to being able to do those things that help you regulate. And you also didn't know that you were doing those things to help you regulate. And
Right.
so you're
Right.
like, oh my gosh, like I'm like overwhelmed. I'm on edge, I'm irritable, all this stuff. And it's because a lot of times, like spending time alone
Mhm.
is a huge way to self-regulate. I
Right.
know for me it is. And so when you have a child, it's 24/7 and you
Mhm.
don't get any time alone. And so there's no way for you to recover
Right.
almost
Right. Right.
from that. Um, an inability to engage in like physical movement or your areas of interest,
Mhm.
so we have a lot of special interests like can't do it. It's like you can't do the things that you did before to help you regulate your nervous system.
Right.
Um, and then we talked about the increase of risk of postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. That's an issue. Um, People lack someone else to watch their child, right? In order
Mm.
to get that time to themselves. And then also there's a fear of judgment from other people
Yeah.
and like thinking like I'm a bad mom if I need help, what's wrong with me? Um there also could be like, right, there's a lot of co-regulation that has to go on between parent and child, but if the parent can't access the self-regulating strategies,
Mhm.
then they're not going to be, they're like overstimulating. They can't co regulate with their baby. And there also may be like a different sensory needs between parent and child, too,
Right. Right. Sure.
and so like that's a thing. And then also, like, what we see is like the increased pressure to socialize with activities that have to do with your child. And so,
Oh, yeah.
like doing that, there's exhaustion, overwhelm. But if you opt not to do it, there's tremendous guilt
Right.
because you're like, I'm not doing this. I should be doing this, but that is exhausting, things like that. Um, so,
I know you
yeah,
did, sorry. I know you did a research a research project on this. And I assume that like you found this out from the responses
yeah,
from the people. Yeah.
yeah, we
Well,
did. Yeah,
did you get a lot of interest in this?
we did surprisingly. So we did a survey
Mm-hmm.
and we got 175 people to respond
That's
within like
great.
4 weeks, which is
Wow.
amazing.
Yeah.
And interestingly, out of those 175, only 10 of them had a diagnosis pre-child.
Okay.
So most all are diagnosed after having children.
Mm.
So, which makes it challenging when you are pregnant and you're giving birth when you don't know you're autistic, because of all of like changes in your body and then all the medical appointments and the experience in the hospital, all that. So there's all that.
Right.
And then there's a lot of trauma in the birth experience because of that.
Mm.
And just, yeah. And so, I mean, we found these are like the highlights of what we found in that, but
Yeah.
people can read more right on my website that we'll share the link to that as well. But it's fascinating.
Right. It's also quite sad. I mean, just thinking of 100 out of 175, only 10 already had a diagnosis. It's 165 people who
Yeah.
have gone a lot of their life without knowing what's going on. It's a huge number.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, you were saying that a lot of like physicians aren't looking for this, but also I can say a lot of therapists aren't trained in this as well. Certainly, I wasn't.
Yeah.
Um, and it's got me thinking about how much more training we should be getting outside of grad school, and just being able to notice or screen or ask questions about this so that we can support our clients better.
Well, and the other thing, I'm working with Dr. Megan Anna Neff from Neurodivergent Insights, I, with to create something that even the people who are doing the assessments on the children, or who are OTs working with children, or
Mm,
the pediatricians, when you diagnose a kid,
mm,
you should also give the parents some information like, oh, you might want to look into yourself.
sure.
No one has said that to me or anybody. And so that's another thing. It's like when a child is neurodivergent, you should give the parents some information about like,
Mm,
well, what about yourself? What are like 10 signs that you might be neurodivergent, and just resources for them.
right.
Because again, I feel like even with a diagnosis with my son, it was very much like, here you go. Okay. And then again, you have to go research, advocate, all that, which is
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah, it sure is. So I've heard people, maybe going back to the stigma a little bit, like, oh, everybody has a diagnosis of ADHD and they're just like handing this out and so on and so forth. But I think anchoring it in what you've said about like 80% of people have not been diagnosed, and a lot of um well, I guess anyone who's not a white boy, which is an incredibly helpful frame also. Um, it's not like all of the sudden it's the diagnosis of the day and people are just handing it out. It's that their providers were not informed, people weren't looking for it, people have been suffering. And I think it's an important, like, just to call it out, that I've heard it, I'm sure you've heard it too, that, oh yeah, everybody has ADHD now.
Yeah.
It's just another way of I guess minimizing somebody's experience. And like, okay, so what if everybody has ADHD now? Great, they have a diagnosis, they have support, or they know what's going on, or there's just it's just a kind of a yucky thing that is out there.
Yeah.
And it's another way of mm, making it hard for people to get the help they need. If you
Yeah.
feel shame after somebody says that, then you're less likely to be open about it or seek support.
Yeah. Because then you think to yourself, well, maybe everyone's like, oh, like everyone's brain's different. Everybody's brain's different, you
Mhm,
know?
mhm,
Well, okay, but does that mean, it does make you think about, well, maybe I don't need to seek those accommodations, or I maybe this is a silly road to go down and
mhm,
find out about.
mhm,
And there's so many helpful things that are out there. I mean, medication is helpful, but it's not the only thing.
mhm.
There's so many other things, just like as an OT, it's like we can put all these tips and strategies and tools to help someone feel supported and structured. So it's, yeah, there's help out there.
I mean, I'm so incredibly grateful for you starting this conversation with me here on this podcast. And I hope to have many more conversations about it because it's so, so important. Um, and for people who are thinking that this might be something that they resonate with, or don't know where to go, or don't know what to do, what kinds of things would you suggest?
Well, because I started sharing this so much with people, I had a Google folder, and then I just put it on my website. So I have a page on my website that's under the neurodiversity tab. So it's drkyliehannish.com/neurodiversity that has kind of a summary of what we talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has links to my favorite resources, because there's so many resources out there in terms of people on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of information out there, but I just, to not overwhelm people, I culled it down. Like my favorite go-to is Neurodivergent Insights. That's kind of where I've resonated. And she has a community that you can join as well, whether you're a person who is neurodivergent or you're a therapist who wants to help support neurodivergent clients. There's just a lot of
Great.
education. So that's been great. She does have screeners for autism and ADHD. I mean, they're not her screeners. It's just like a list of recommended screeners.
Oh, got it. Got it.
That's a way to start. And I think, yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I would go to the website. That has a
Mm-hmm.
lot of links. My favorite book, it's a new book by Dr. Devin Price. It's called Unmasking Autism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just looking at neurodiversity in so many new and different ways. So I really enjoyed that. He's also spoken on a few podcasts, if that works better for you. So my three favorite podcasts, Divergent Conversations that I mentioned, Uniquely Human podcast is good. So that's a little bit more directed towards children, but not only.
Mm-hmm.
And Two Sides of the Spectrum is with an OT. So again, a little bit more directed towards children, but not only, because Devin Price was on both of those
Mm-hmm.
podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think what's changing with neurodivergence in general is the idea that before we approach it very much from a medical model, deficits based, and that someone needs to be fixed or changed and using ABA. But now it is people in the autism community do not want that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't, ABA is like training a dog, and it's, even though it's what insurance will pay for, it is not what is the best for people with autism.
Mm-hmm.
So rather looking at it like a strengths-based approach, looking at how do we change the environment, how do we change the task,
Mm-hmm.
how do we understand like what is that person's sensory needs, what's going on. I mean, it's
Right.
more complicated than that, but
Sure. Yeah.
And then I have, as I said, like I have links to information about neurodivergence and hormones,
Mm-hmm.
autism and parenting, co-occurring health conditions. So all of that is on this one page.
That's awesome. It's just amazing that you've put all of that together for people. I mean, I know it just changes your life when you know what's going on. There's no way around
Yeah.
that. It just helps so much.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people have that feeling like that something's feeling different. And I think maybe even the way social media is set up makes it even worse in a lot of ways. Because you have whatever type of people sort of make it to the top of who's in your feed, have a certain skill set. And if you are home alone or whatever, looking on online and comparing yourself to somebody that might be just very different than you, and this happens across the board too with just perinatal mood and anxiety disorders too. It can be isolating. You can feel alone, but I mean, this is opening a door. What you're talking about is opening a door for a lot of people to find answers. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this.
Thank you. Yeah. I think I want to start. I think there's a need for a group like autistic mother, like kind of social support group online that I think could be
Absolutely.
helpful, because again, I don't fit in anywhere. And I mean, it's similar. There is a lot of similarities, I will say, between being a bereaved parent and being autistic. I don't
Mm.
know why, but there just are. In terms of the, like, I feel different, the people I'll
Mhm.
connect with most are, like, other bereaved parents, but I can say the same with people who are autistic. It's like you get each other.
Yeah, right,
Um,
right.
and then interestingly enough, like with Return to Zero, I didn't know this before, but like the way that I've created Return to Zero, the resources, the way we do support groups is very much neurodivergent affirming
Mm,
because that's what I needed. So in
right, right,
terms
right,
of
right.
like needing to know, okay, well, what is going to happen? Can you explain things to me? And doing it in a very like easy list format and just things
Mm,
like that. But I didn't know that's what it was, but it is, or like in the group, because I don't like social groups of any kind, but making things really structured and trying to create safety and
mhm,
choice and things
mhm.
like that. So interesting.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that with us, and I really hope that folks out there who are listening feel seen and heard and are able to get the resources for themselves.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me share my story and sharing just all about this. Like, I'm obviously excited about it.
I
So,
love it, yes,
um,
I am too.
yeah. So it's great, and I just hope there'll be more conversations about this so we can raise awareness and get people to learn about themselves and receive diagnosis earlier in life.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For more information, go to drkyliehannish.com/neurodiversity. For a lot of the links that she talked with us about on this episode, you can find those resources there. And you can also find her on social media at Kylie Hannish. I'm very grateful to Kylie for bringing this conversation to the podcast and really exploring with us stuff that we should know. It's such an important conversation, and I hope it helps to further people's awareness and information on autism and ADHD, specifically as it relates to perinatal mental health. For those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, please go check and make sure you're getting all of the episodes downloaded directly to you. There were some changes in how podcasts were categorized and downloaded, and it may have affected how you are receiving your downloads or if you're getting them at all. So go to your podcast app and make sure that you are subscribed and you're getting all of these episodes downloaded to you. For those of you who are new to the podcast, please go do subscribe to the podcast. It's free and you can get these episodes directly to you. You can listen to them whenever you want. And there's such a huge catalog of episodes to look through and see what works for you. But honestly, the more subscribers that I have on this podcast and the more people who are regularly getting their downloads, the better it is for the podcast and more people get to see it in their feeds. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Your support means the world and it helps keep the podcast going. Thanks so much for being here. Until next time.